The first thing we want to do in this demo is enable endpoint routing. For that, we make a small change to how we set up the request pipeline. We make sure it matches what we learned on the slides. So first we add the routing middleware to the request pipeline. And now we call into use endpoints. We configure these by calling into map controllers, which adds endpoints for controller actions without specifying routes. Specifying these routes, that's what we will do with attributes. So let's switch to our controller to apply these attributes. We know we want to respond to a GET request, so let's use the HTTP GET attribute. We want this controller action to be executed when we send the request to, say, API/cities. So that's what we pass in as the routing template. And let's test this. So we navigate to the HTTPS address. In my case, that's port 7169. And we navigate to the cities endpoint. So /API/cities. And we get back our two cities. As we know, another way to test this would be via the documentation UI. We see that we again have an endpoint in our documentation we can test. We can simply click try it out, execute, and here's our cities. So that's nice. We've just created our first API action that actually works. Let's switch back to our controller. A controller typically contains other actions, for example to get a single city, or maybe to create or update one. How these are consumed should be consistent. In other words, we want to consume all our resources by starting with API. And all the resources in this controller should start with API/cities, as this is the cities controller. We can use the route attribute at controller level for this. Like this, we only have to define this part of the template once and not on each action. That means that our HTTP GET attribute no longer requires us to pass through a template, as we want to execute the getCities method at API/cities. Now, this template we pass in here contains the plural noun cities, and that matches the prefix of the controller class name. You can refer to that by putting controller in straight brackets in the template. This will then match the route API/cities to the cities controller. But to be honest, I'm not a big fan of this approach. If we were to have a refactoring of our code later on and rename the controller class, the URI to our cities resource would automatically change as well. This can be considered an advantage, but for APIs it's more of a disadvantage in my opinion, as a resource URI should remain the same, regardless of what the underlying class is named. That's of no importance to the consumer. But that's just my opinion. You're obviously free to disregard it if you want. Nevertheless, I'm going to change it back to API/cities. And let's give this a try to see if our route attribute effectively works. We navigate to the documentation UI. Our endpoint shows up. We click try it out, execute, and there we go. We still get back our two cities. Now, this documentation UI or using the browser, those are two ways to send requests and inspect responses. But personally, I prefer using a tool that allows easier configuration of requests and a more convenient way of inspecting responses, Postman. Let's have a look at that.